Now, the second that you saw the thumbnail to this video, you were probably thinking, dang, that is a good looking rig right there, son. How can I build myself one of those bad girls? Well, you're in the right spot, my friends, because today I am going to walk you through how I built this thing. I will tell you what went well and what changes I would make if I were to start over again. Before we get rolling here, I just want to say two things. First of all, this camper is actually a topper. And so, what I mean by that is the whole camper itself is actually mounted to my truck bed rails versus being a traditional slide in camper. Second would be that I built this thing with no prior construction experience. I've never built a shed or a deck or anything like that. Prior to starting this build, I didn't even own a drill. So I learned everything on how to build this by watching some YouTube videos. I just want to briefly spend a minute here talking about the particular camper that inspired this build. So prior to building this thing, I looked at all different kinds of campers, from big giant campers like this one to, the flatbed pop-up campers. And, I looked at maybe just getting a travel trailer. And of course, at one point I was convinced that van life was the perfect decision for me. But eventually I realized that I really liked this four-wheel camper Project M model here. And the reason why I like this camper is because of the fact that it just sits on your truck bed rails. Okay, so it's not a slide-in camper. And I like that because you have access to your full truck bed, which allows you to leave the camper on your truck and you can still use your truck like normal, right? You can throw some sheets of plywood in the back, or you could buy something off Facebook Marketplace and throw it in the back. And so by going with this camper, first and foremost, I can camp out of it. But second of all, I can still continue to use my truck the way I intend to. Now, the problem with this rig is after you spec it out and get everything that you want, it's going to be like well over $20,000. You spend nearly $4,000 just on delivery fees and installation fees and taxes. And I just simply didn't want to spend over $20,000 on a camper. And I did temporarily consider getting like a traditional truck topper, but you can certainly sleep out of the back of these, but you can't like comfortably sit in the back. If you're like sitting in a camping chair in the back, your head is just hitting the roof. So next what I did is I just started binge watching all kinds of camper builds on YouTube. And most people kind of build them like this, where it's really a traditional slide-in camper. And they build out this tub, and it just ends up being so heavy. Some of these builds end up being like over 2,000 pounds. And really what I wanted to build was my own version of the Project M. So the very first step was I needed to buy a truck. At the time I was driving a Subaru Impreza, and I looked at all kinds of different trucks, and I finally decided to go with a regular cab 8-foot bed truck. And this is the one that I got. And so to me, I prioritized like having as much space as possible in the bed, and because of that, I sacrificed having back seats in my truck. Now, as I was planning this build, I had spent a couple weekends just sleeping in the bed of my truck, and my setup kind of looked like this, where I had some gear on the left side, and I was basically just sleeping on a cot, and I was sleeping in a sleeping bag wrapped in a tarp. And the tarp actually worked really well as being a windbreaker. But what I realized is I hated the fact that I was sleeping north to south like this, and it just took up so much room. And if I was going to build this camper, I needed to come up with a way to sleep east to west, right? And then I could slide like all of my totes underneath the bed, and I would have as much space as possible back here to just like sit in a chair and hang out and cook a meal or whatever, right? So eventually I just put together a list of my camper priorities, okay? So let's just walk through those. The first thing that I wanted was a really lightweight camper. I didn't want this thing to be 2,000 pounds, and in order to do that, it had to be like a camper topper that didn't have one of those base tubs that people typically make. My next priority was I wanted the camper to be relatively affordable. And so for me, that was a couple of $1,000s. I wanted to try to build it for like less than maybe 2 or 3 grand. The next really big priority for me was I wanted the camper to be able to fit in my garage. So I live up north and we have really hard winters, and I wanted to be able to park my camper in the garage during the winter. And so that means that it had to be able to fit in an 8 foot garage door. And so with that in mind, like I wouldn't be able to build it super tall like this one where I could stand up in it. But it could be taller than a traditional topper. And so really my goal was to just build something that I could comfortably sit in. All right, so we'll kind of rip through the remaining priorities here. Um, the next would be that I wanted to be able to easily load my canoe on top of the camper. I wanted to be able to use my truck bed. So if I had to buy some plywood or purchase something off of Facebook Marketplace, like I wanted to be able to keep the camper on my truck and still use my truck bed. And finally, I wanted to sleep east to west to maximize the space in the camper. Now, as I was planning this build, I was actually living in a 3-story apartment and I had nowhere to build it. So after buying the truck, the next priority was I needed to move, really. And I spent a bit of time trying to find a house where I had a garage to build the camper. And I finally found this place. It had a nice 2-car garage. I think it was like 25 feet by 30 feet or something like that. But a reasonable space to build the rig. So eventually the day came for me to start planning and building the camper. And the very first thing that I built was this cart. And this is without a doubt one of the best decisions that I made. And so this cart is going to basically be the platform that I build the camper on. And the size of this cart is the exact size of my truck bed. So like the height and the width and the length is the exact dimensions of my truck bed. And the reason why this was such a good idea is because I was just able to wheel the camper around as I was building it. So I've got like wheels on all 4 corners. And I was also able to like sit in the camper and feel out the size of it without having to load the camper onto my truck. Next, what I did is I spent about a week building a 3D model of the camper. And so I was building like these random little walls to like gauge the size of the camper. And so this is the chair that I plan to sit in the camper. And I was trying to understand like, what would this feel like? Like how much headspace would I have? And I'll show you here in a second, but I was using a software called TinkerCad to build a 3D model of the camper. And I was just building a bunch of like mock prototype walls just to see like, will it fit in my garage door and how much space will I have? Okay, so I just want to give you a quick overview here of TinkerCad. If you've never used TinkerCad before, it is very simple. So basically this is kind of the design that I came up with, and I'm very happy that I built out the 3D model of it because it really lets you just understand what it's going to look like. So just for your understanding, all of these blue pieces are 2x2s, the red pieces are 2x4s, the green pieces are 2x1s, and then this brown base here is a 2x10. And so yeah, it was just very helpful to build this out and get an understanding of what it's going to look like and help me plan the build. So just to give a little overview of the design, I've got some doors in the back here, which is a little bit complicated, and I'll talk about that later, but this brown piece is what's going to sit on top of the bed rail, so that's like my base. I've got a window on each side, and it's going to be a cab over design. So I can't sleep up here, but it's just like some room for some extra gear, and it also helps support like my canoe when it's on the roof. All right, so the very first part of the camper that I built was the base, and that's kind of this big horseshoe thing that you're looking at here. And in my first version of the base, I really just made it out of 2x10s, and I decided to abort that. It wasn't super durable, and I ended up coming up with this more layered design where the top and bottom piece is actually a 1/2 inch piece of plywood. And then the middle piece is a 1x10. And I glued everything together and screwed it down. Now, looking at this picture, obviously the left side isn't fully finished. I hadn't glued down the top piece of plywood, but here's a kind of a close-up view of the layers. So you've got the 1/2 inch piece of plywood, the 1x10 in the middle, and then another 1/2 inch piece of plywood on the bottom. Next, I moved on to building a couple of the walls. And so in some of these pictures, it's kind of hard to see because it blends in with the walls of my garage. But this was the first wall that I built. And as of right now, it's like scooted all the way to the inner edge of the base, but it's just sitting there because it wasn't actually screwed down yet. But once I built the wall in the base, I put it on my truck just to feel it out and see how it looked. And that's what we're looking at here. All right. Here's another photo of the walls. Things are finally starting to take shape a bit, and they're mounted down to the base. Again, I cannot stress the importance of building the cart. Like, it was just so helpful to be able to wheel the camper around the garage. I would often like wheel the camper out into the driveway and then build a wall and then wheel the camper back in. And so it was just so helpful to have it on top of the cart. But yeah, walls are starting to come together a bit here. Next, I moved on to putting some sheets of plywood on the walls. And so on the sides of the camper, I used a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood, not lumen, which I think it's called, but this is actually a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood, which can be kind of hard to find sometimes. And on the roof, I used a 1/2 inch sheet of plywood. Now, again, I am not in construction and I don't know anything, but I did try to be somewhat intentional with my sheets of plywood. And so for the front of the camper, this is all one sheet, and I intentionally did that so that it would just add some additional strength for the nose. I could have used like one full 8-foot sheet of plywood like along the whole length of the camper and then just like cover the nose in an additional sheet, but there just would have been a seam right here, and I feel like that would have reduced the strength. So as I was building the walls, I decided to order some windows, and I got all of my windows from this website called Rec Pro, and they sell like all kinds of RV parts. And you can certainly cheap out and get some really cheap windows from like Home Depot or something, but I wanted some really nice windows that like opened up and had a screen on them. And so I got these 30 by 20 inch windows, and on half the side they have like a screen that you can open. And so this is kind of what it looks like once I finally got it. So here's another look at the camper and kind of what I did for the roof beams. I kind of have a mixture of 2x4s and a couple of 2x2s on the roof. And here's a window that's like fitted into the wall, but I haven't actually mounted it down yet. All right, so this next photo was a massive milestone for me. Basically all the walls are done and I've got the roof done, and this was the first time that I put my canoe on the roof, and I was so unbelievably excited. This window isn't actually fully secured yet. I just mounted this little 2x2 that I could swivel around and take the window in and out with, but this also highlights kind of what I'm doing for a roof rack. So I've got these L brackets here. They kind of look like this. And basically my roof rack is just some 2x4s screwed together. And I was going to take a bolt and like drill it through the 2x2s, and it would go into that L bracket. And that would allow me to just take the roof rack on and off. So at this point I was ready to paint the camper. I hadn't completed the back wall yet, and I tackled that kind of at the end. But for painting, what I did was I covered the roof in several coats of liquid Flex Seal, and I painted the entire camper, including the roof, in this Raptor truck bed liner. So as part of the painting process, I converted my garage into like this little paint booth. I like hung up a whole bunch of plastic around the walls, And again, this was like a rental property that I was living in, and so I didn't want to get paint all over the landlord's walls. But I used a spray gun to spray probably like 3 or 4 coats of truck bed liner all over the entire camper. Now, using truck bed liner as paint did work out pretty well for me, but certainly if you wanted the best, you'd probably want to try out like the poor man's fiberglass that a few other people have used. But for me, the truck bed liner worked just fine. So as I was painting the camper, I decided I wanted to mount like a light bar to the front of the camper. And so I ordered this, I think it's a 52-inch light bar off of Amazon, and it was like $40. And honestly, this thing was amazing for $40. And so the way that this thing kind of works is, again, it's mounted to the nose of the camper, and the wire to this light bar goes through the camper, and I ended up cutting a hole down here, and it popped out down here, and I ran it underneath like my truck and connected it to my battery, and then I have a switch in the cab of my truck. And so that might sound a little bit complicated, but it was pretty easy. I did it in like an hour. All right, so the next big giant question and elephant in the room was, how in the heck was I going to get this camper on my truck? And at the time, I was living pretty far up north. I didn't have any friends to help me, and I was a little stuck on how was I going to get this thing on my truck. And so I considered a few options. I mean, the best option would be to get the 4-corner like camper jack mounts, where you kind of get this bracket that mounts to each corner of your camper, and then you get these camper jacks. And so you can get some electric ones, or you can get ones like this one where you just use a drill to like raise it and lower it. But these things are really expensive, and to get all 4 of these jacks and the brackets is well over $1,000. At one point, I even considered like putting together a little pulley system where I was gonna try to like connect the camper to the ceiling and pulley the camper up and then back underneath it. But I was just so terrified of collapsing my landlord's roof and him charging me thousands of dollars to fix it. So that wasn't an option. So really the best thing that I could come up with was to get these camper jacks, and they're $500, which isn't cheap, but it was the best thing that I could come up with. And basically you get 2 jacks, and so the plan would be to put one on each side, and you kind of like crank up the camper, and then I was gonna back underneath it and drop the camper down. So that's what I decided to do, and I ordered these camper jacks, and here's what they look like. Now, the problem is that the base of these camper jacks are actually pretty wide, and I wouldn't be able to back my truck underneath this camper without my tires hitting these jacks. So in order to overcome this issue, here's what I came up with. It's a little kind of hard to see in this photo, but this is what we're looking at. I decided to build this platform that went underneath the camper, and it's like significantly wider than my truck, okay? And so there's really 3 pieces that we're looking at. You've got these 2x4s in the front here, this like base platform, and then some 2x4s in the back. And so the plan was to like take these jacks and lift them up onto these outer 2x4s, and then slide in this base platform underneath the camper. And at that point, I was gonna hoist the camper all the way up and back underneath it and lower the camper onto my truck. Really lower the camper onto these front and back stacks of 2x4. And that would allow me to pull out the base and then drop the camper down onto the truck. And so that's what I did, but I will say that this was so unbelievably sketchy, and it was extremely tippy. When I had this thing, like I had to crank it basically all the way up. It was so tippy, and I was absolutely terrified that the camper was gonna fall off, but I was more terrified that it was gonna like fall off and like crash into one of the walls of the garage and completely destroy the garage. I really wish I would have taken a video of me trying to load this camper onto the truck, but I was honestly just panicking, and it was so scary that I had to focus on not dropping this camper. But eventually I did it, and this is kind of what it looked like as soon as I got the camper onto the truck. And I just want to highlight one other thing in this picture really quick. Going back to the light bar, again, the cable for the light bar goes into the camper, like through the nose, kind of goes down along the front of the camper here, and it pokes out the front of the camper and goes like in between my bed and the cab of the truck. And like, here's the cable for that. And I ended up like running this cable underneath my truck and like through my engine bay and into my battery. And at that point, I was able to like kind of wire a switch into the whole situation as well. Again, it might sound complicated, but it was very simple. So after finally loading the camper onto the truck, I honestly probably just sat in a chair for a couple of hours, and it just really in disbelief. And it finally came time to see if it would even fit through the garage door, and it did. I had about 3 inches of clearance. And this is kind of what it looked like for the first time of me pulling it out of the garage. At this point, the camper it's just sitting on my bed rails. It's not fully secured. So the next thing that I did is I got these like really large 3/4 inch bolts, and I bolted it directly to the bed rails. I literally just drilled a hole through the bed rail. So each bed rail has like 3 of these bolts, one in the front, one in the middle, and one in the back. Now that the camper was fully secured down, I moved on to the back wall. Now, the back wall was a little complicated. I kind of wanted to build out this 4-door panel system. And the goal was I wanted to be able to like open each door side like a normal door, but I also wanted to be able to open it with my tailgate closed. And so I've kind of got these like 4 door panels that all go together. Now I'll mention that these top 2 doors, I messed them up and there was too much of a gap here and I had to rebuild them, but they all kind of open in a certain sequence because each door has like a little lip on the inside with a weather seal strip to prevent like wind coming in. So this would be the door that opens first, and then you could open either of these 2 doors next, and then finally this is the 3rd door that could open. Okay, so here's a little video of the doors opening. Once again, the doors are in no way whatsoever complete, and they don't have the inner lip with the weather seal, but I just want to show you how the doors actually open. And the goal of these doors was I wanted to be able to just take the doors off and use my truck bed, right? So I could just pull out the door hinge bolt on each of these doors, and then, you know, my truck bed would just be wide open, and I could put sheets of plywood back here or put whatever I wanted in the bed of the truck and just use it like a normal truck. Okay, so once I finished the doors and finished rebuilding these top 2 doors and adding the sheets of plywood on the back, I painted the whole thing, and I was ready to go on my first trip. And I just kind of cruised around the woods a bit, and I was just so excited to run this thing. This is what the back looks like once it's fully complete. I've got a couple of handles on the back, and for the door handle, I actually got one of these padlock door handles, so that way, I could lock my stuff in the back and just type in a code to get in. Okay, so to end things off here, I'll just run you through some random pictures. We'll start with the light bar. Again, I think I spent like 40 or 50 bucks on this thing, and I could not believe how effective it was. On the left photo here, this is just my normal high beams, and on the right, this is with the light bar. Here's another photo with the light bar. It just floods so much light. It was awesome. During the process of all this, I actually restored my grandpa's 1956 aluminum canoe as well, which turned out pretty good. Threw some fresh tires on the rig, and yeah, it was awesome. It's really hard to get like a good picture to show what the inside looks like, but here's a photo that I have. I put like a piece of carpet kind of on the floor, and I'm able to tuck all of my gear underneath the bed. My bed is really just like a sheet of plywood screwed to some 2x4s, and I've got a little piece of foam that I sleep on top of. But I was able to sleep, east to west, and I think I have about like 6'4" in length here. Well, I guess in width. On my first few expeditions, I was quite nervous, to be honest with you. I didn't know how durable it was going to be and if I would have any issues, but it was 100% completely rock solid. And where I live, I just spend a ton of time going down roads like this, and it's lightweight and it's not too bulky, and I'm able to just drive down just unmaintained dirt roads. And at one point, I also drove all the way out to Oregon from Minnesota. Drove to like Oregon and Utah and Montana and the whole shebang. And so that's pretty much it. That's the build. Just to give you some final specs here on the camper, it weighs about 600 pounds. I think I spent probably about $3,000 in material, and on top of that, I spent maybe an additional $1,500 on tools. I had basically no tools at the start of this project, and I mostly just needed a drill and a couple of saws and some miscellaneous things that add up pretty quick. But that was my build, and I appreciate you watching.